Okay, good afternoon and welcome to the Senate. I'm Andrea D'Alessandro and I'm the ranking member of Natural Resources, Energy, and Water in the Senate. Welcome to those of you on the panel. We're being taped today and we're very grateful that you have come from Arizona State University. And this is part of a three-event series that we've put on here at the Senate. Our first one was with U of A professors who talked about fire and water, and that was last month. Today we're concentrating on policy in several areas that you're experts in. And then in December, on December 5th, we're having a border and environment issue because I represent southern Arizona, part of Pima County, and all of Santa Cruz County, so I have a big part of the border, both in Pima and in all of Santa Cruz. For those of you attending in the audience, we welcome your questions at the appropriate time, and we ask you to come to the podium because the event is being taped. Today we will give brief bios of our presenters, but when for those of you who can't be here today, you will be given a link that you can see the presentation as well as the complete bios of the gracious panelists who have come taking time from their busy schedule of teaching and doing research from Arizona State University. So welcome. Today we're going to start with just to go over our topic today is solution spaces for a changing climate. Rapid global and regional change can pose challenges to social, economic, and environmental systems. However, there is a wide range of pathways and strategies that governments, businesses, and citizens can take to manage change in a positive way. In this presentation, 4 faculty members from ASU will lay out solution spaces for sectors of central importance to Arizona, including energy, agriculture, and the urban environment. Our first speaker is going to be Dr. Sonja Klinsky, who is an assistant professor at the School of Sustainability at ASU. Prior to this, she was a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Cambridge and with the Pacific Institute for Climate Solutions. She received her PhD from the University of British Columbia in Natural Resource Management and Environmental Studies. She is, interested in policy and finding solutions to complex challenges that we face. She also has experience in the United Nations Framework Convention, and I'm very grateful to her because she assembled this panel, and I welcome you to the Senate, Dr. Klinsky.
Thanks so much. Thank you very much, and welcome to people who are here, and it's a really pleasure to have ASU be able to be here today. I thought I would just start by giving a bit of a landscape for what we're talking about, both in terms of the climate changes, but really in terms of the policy landscape change. As a government body, we're responsible not only for thinking about how to change in response to the climate, but also thinking about the broader policy shifts that are relevant to us. So first, I'm going to do a couple of slides just to remind us what the global issue is in terms of climate change. This is data from NASA, and it shows us where carbon dioxide emissions are moving over the last 400,000 years. And you can see a very, very rapid spike at the end, which suggests that we are seeing a period of growth of greenhouse gas emissions in the atmosphere much more rapid than anything we've seen in over 500,000 years. And in the next slide, you'll see that the change in this is so fast. On the one side of the slide, you'll see the last 22,000 years in terms of where emissions or where concentrations of CO2, which is one of our greenhouse gases, is. You see how much change there has been in 22,000 years. In the slide or the image next door to it, you see only the last, go back for a second. In the image next door to it, you see only the last 70 years. we've had as much growth in the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere in 70 years than we had seen in the entire last 22,000 years. In fact, if you look at the first image on this slide, you'll see a line partway through when about 11,000 years ago, and you see how thin that line is. We could take the entire second part of that slide and move it over. That line represents how much space 70 years looks like in a 22,000 period. So we see that in that space, that amount of change is so rapid. We have never seen anything like this on the planet. Current concentrations of greenhouse gas in the atmosphere, the last time it was here was between 3 and 5 million years ago. Now, what are people doing about it? And this is really where we start to talk about a policy landscape. Last year, I had the pleasure of being at the UN climate negotiations. I've done that for many years. And we saw every single country in the world, almost, come forth with global commitments in terms of what they were going to do. And when you look at this, we see over 96% of countries in the UN system came forth with what they call an INDC, which is a intended nationally determined contributions. These are voluntary, bottom-up commitments that each country took based on their own assessment of what would work for their country. These are not top-down, or they're not dictated to countries, but countries themselves came with the idea of what they could do. We see that this covers basically the entire global economy, and it covers the entire world population. So we see essentially universal agreement at the UN level that we are going to do something about this. Now, what are they doing? So let's look at this. One of the most popular things that countries are doing is putting some kind of a price on carbon dioxide emissions. This is a very common approach to dealing with the problem. It's being taken not only by countries, but also by subnational regions and often some companies. This graph or this map simply shows you where in the world are jurisdictions purposely putting a price on carbon dioxide. This is not a new policy. It's a very well established and understood one, which means that it actually is a really useful policy for us to know about because there's an enormous amount of experience we can learn from because so many other jurisdictions in the world have already done this in various ways. Next slide. And one of the things I want to draw to your attention is how rapid this development has been. So you see that over the last essentially 10 years, we've gone from having a very small portion of the world's greenhouse gas emissions within a pricing system to a place where we're quite rapidly reaching, depending on what happens in China in the next year or two, we could be in a situation where over a quarter of the world's populations are within a pricing system. So this is an important thing for jurisdictions like Arizona to pay attention to. The issue here isn't only how climate change itself will affect the state, but how this kind of shift in the global economy and how other jurisdictions are regulating their emissions will also have an effect on Arizona and on the United States in general. Most of our large trading partners are already participating in these kinds of pricing systems, and that has a number of implications for how the United States will be dealt with at the geopolitical level. Now, some people often say, okay, that's fine. That's just, countries. What about other jurisdictions? Well, many of those carbon price systems are actually happening at the subnational level. So that would include states and provinces, often some cities themselves. But we also see from this is the most recent data we have from 2000 and the end of 2016, which is looking at jurisdictions which are not just governments and not just country governments, but actually a much broader range of jurisdictions who are being involved in a policy space here. So we see, for instance, there's over 2,500 cities in the world who are committed to some kind of greenhouse gas management plan. You see companies, an enormous number of companies controlling trillions of dollars, literally trillions of dollars, who are making a variety of kinds of commitments through the UN system to make it very evident they are attempting to change how the economy works. Indeed, we even see investors starting to think differently about how they're pricing investments, how they're assessing investments, and the kinds of information they're demanding from various other companies in terms of who they will and will not lend to and how they will engage with various jurisdictions. What we see from this image is we see not only individual countries or states taking action, but actually an enormous range of actors working to change not only how we regulate, but how the economy works in relation to both carbon impacts directly and also thinking differently about how we would deal with a changing climate. Now, one of the images, this is a slightly old data. This is 2013. It would look even more dramatic if I had been able to quickly pull up the most recent data. One of the things that's important, especially for any jurisdiction, but especially one like Arizona, where we do have huge solar potential, is to understand what's happening in the global solar market. Now, if we look, you'll see 3 pie charts. If you look at the one that's mostly green, what we're looking here is global solar module production. So who's making solar panels and where are they coming from? You'll see here that China is by far the big player internationally. And that leads to a lot of questions for us. We know that certain countries, for instance, India, a quarter of India right now is not electrified. That means a quarter of the population of India, it's about 250,000 people, do not have access to electricity. Well, what sources of electricity are they going to be looking to in the future? In many of the areas which do not have electricity right now, it is now cheaper to use solar electrification than traditional fossil fuels because of the expense of laying out grids in hard-to-reach rural areas. Which means that if you are the world's largest solar producer, and you're now looking at a world in which you have literally billions of people looking to electrify, they're going to be looking to markets in certain places. And this is not being regulated by a single country, although China recently did just announce over $300 billion of investment in renewable energy. What we're seeing is a shift not run by countries, but run by companies interested in changing how the economy works and where energy will come from. And Professor Gary Dirks will be talking about that in greater depth in a moment. So what that has shown us is that we have countries who are taking action in a variety of ways, including carbon pricing. We have individual regions, city governments, state governments taking action on climate change in a wide variety of ways. And we have corporations who are seeing new opportunities and they're taking action in a variety of ways. Now, this data is a different kind of information. This is the number of legal cases that have been lodged against states and corporations for failing to take adequate climate action. And what we see here in the last few years is an absolute astronomical increase in the use of the legal system to put pressure on jurisdictions which are not addressing climate change. This is some data from the best source we currently have, the Sabin Center for Climate Law tracks all of the cases globally. My student put this together by searching the database. And what we see in 2016, we had over 100 cases. Now, these are really varied. Some of them are aimed at particular corporations for failing to have adequate and transparent disclosure of their carbon risks. Some of these are at state. The state of Oregon, for instance, is being taken to court by young people for the concern about climate change. And unlike previous suits, this one is actually getting standing in the courts. We also see countries. The country of Netherlands was sued and was found liable for failing to adequately address climate change. And their own courts forced the Netherlands to change their own domestic law. So we see here another line of argument that's unrolling very, very quickly, which is changing the policy landscape for jurisdictions at all levels and with corporations as well. Now, what are we going to do about this? One of the benefits of these pressures means that we can think about climate policy on many different fronts. And I think it's a misnomer. People often think that climate change policy looks like only one thing. It looks like only reducing emissions or only looks like energy policy. This is a very, very kind of back of the envelope way of thinking about different kinds of jurisdictions and the different kinds of opportunities they have to engage with the climate issue through their policy controls. So for instance, you might say, well, what does protecting vulnerable and low-income populations have to do with climate change? Well, we know that climate impacts are going to have a variety of long-term implications for different populations, and different populations are going to interact with that in different ways. So for instance, Professor Aiken is going to talk in a moment about the agricultural risks in Arizona and how you might engage with that. And there's things that cities right through the federal government can do. Something else like economy-wide carbon pricing, you'll see here it really aims at the state and federal level. You'll notice in all of these, the state level plays a particularly crucial role because it may have power for itself over energy policy, but it may also have guidance, for instance, towards cities in terms of how cities are going to deal with sprawl or transportation-related issues. What I want to draw your attention here to is the diversity of options that a state government has in terms of thinking differently about climate policy. You could make a positive contribution to climate policy by addressing everything from supporting the waste management plans of your cities right through to putting pressure on continuing to have some kind of a carbon price. So the main message I want to leave here today is that every single jurisdiction globally is having to deal with this issue. We have growing recognition from corporations that this is a growing issue. We have legal pressure, and the benefit of all of this is that we have an enormous diversity of kinds of options that we could consider, and there's expertise on each and every single one of these, both from the academic community, but also from jurisdictions which are already trying to do those things. With that, I'm going to turn over to my other colleagues who are going to give you a little more depth about some of the particular sectors with a bit more of an Arizona-specific flavor.
Before he begins, I'd like to say a few words about Dr. Gary Dirks. He's the director of the Julie Ann Wrigley Global Institute of Sustainability and director of Lightworks, an Arizona State University initiative that capitalizes on ASU's strengths in the solar energy and other light-inspired research. He is also the Julie Wrigley Chair of Sustainable Practices and a professor of practice in the School of Sustainability and a distinguished sustainability scientist. When you see his entire resume, you'll realize he's a citizen of the world, having worked extensively in Asia and other places. So welcome again to the Senate, Dr. Dirks.
Thank you very much, Senator. It's a real pleasure to be here today and to address this very important topic. I am going to pick up on a few themes and be slightly more specific about the energy sector. Sonja has given a great overview and has touched on a number of the important issues and the ways in which energy play into the question of solution spaces for a changing climate. I've been associated with the energy sector now since 1975 when I joined the Standard Oil Company of Ohio in Cleveland, Ohio, which later became BP. And following my retirement from BP in 2009, I joined Arizona State University, and as the Senator just mentioned in my bio, continued working on energy. So I've been in this area for more than 40 years. And I can say without a moment's hesitation that I've never seen the sector under as much pressure to change as it is today. And when I say sector, I mean all of it, not power, not transportation, not oil and gas, all of it. It is under pressure to change for many reasons. One of them is clearly climate, but to be quite candid, over the last decade, that hasn't actually been the most important driver. The more important drivers have been changes in technology. If you look, for example, at the very profound changes that hydraulic fracturing has brought to the oil and gas sector, it has completely changed the sector, and not only that, it's changed the geopolitics of the world. We actually have Iran and Saudi Arabia threatening to go to war with each other, and the oil price has barely rippled. Solar energy has dropped dramatically. I mean, truly dramatically. Nobody, even the most ardent supporters of solar energy, saw that coming and how rapid it has happened. As we sit here today, the price of batteries is going down. We can see much more sophisticated technology going into the way in which energy systems are controlled, particularly our grid systems. We have new business models. Solar City is renting people's roofs. Other companies are willing to help you with your planning the way that you use energy. Google, for example, will put a smart thermostat in your house called Nest. We have artificial intelligence that is controlling energy use to the point where it can do things that humans can't. So technology is changing and business models are changing. New entrants are coming into the field. Historically, we think about energy sector, you think about Peabody Coal Company, or you think about British Petroleum, or you think about the China National Petroleum Company from China, or Rosneft in Russia. Today, you have to think about companies like Google, because they're in the energy business. You've got to think about companies like Apple. They're playing in the energy business as well. So we're seeing a lot of new entrants, and they're bringing really interesting new ideas into the field. And then I would also say personal preferences. A lot of people want more control over the energy that comes into their homes. They want to be able to say more about the way in which it's produced. They want to say more about who they get it from. They want to say more about the way in which they use it. So there are many factors that are driving this change in the energy sector. There are a couple of things that I can say for certain about it. One is the system we have today is not going to be the system we have in 20 years' time. And there's absolutely nothing, there is no institution or group of institutions on the planet that are large enough to stop that from happening. Change is going to be here with us. It's going to be deep and profound, and there's nothing that anybody can do to change that. The second thing I would say about it, it's going to be global. Everybody is in the same boat. There is no one place where it's going to happen and the rest stand aside. There's not going to be any place where it doesn't happen and everybody else goes forward. It's going to be a global phenomenon, and it's going to make a really fundamental change in the way the energy sector operates. So as we think about Arizona, it's useful to think about, well, what does this all mean for us? Well, first I would say it means that we're going to change too. Again, to what exactly or how fast exactly remains to be seen. And of course, this body can have something to do with all of that. But it isn't going to look the same as it was. And we can already see that happening with the closure of the Navajo generating station. 3 years ago, I don't think there was anybody that was saying NGS is going to close. In fact, there were some really knowledgeable people saying how critically important it was. Today, in spite of the best efforts of the Navajo to find buyers, it just really doesn't look like that plant's going to be running beyond 2019. Coal is on its way out. And by the way, it has nothing to do with regulation. Coal can't compete. I'll go back to what I said earlier about hydraulic fracturing. Hydraulic fracturing has brought natural gas down to about $3 per million BTU, and coal simply can't compete at that price. And of course, then there's personal preferences too. California won't take out-of-state coal. So we know that it's going to change. How should Arizona position itself in a situation like this? Well, my personal view is that climate change is going to drive ultimately all fossil fuels out of the system. And here I want to take a slight step back and note that that might sound a little bit surprising for an oil man. And you might wonder, well, did one oil man upon retirement get converted and see the light, or however you want to put it? The reality is that British Petroleum, BP, knew in the early 1990s that there was risk associated with climate change. And I can say that with great confidence because by the early 90s I was participating in the strategic planning for the entire company. By 1997, our CEO at the time, John Brown, went to Stanford University and made a speech where he said, the risks associated with climate change must now be addressed. And it was his proposal, and it was the stance of the British Petroleum Company that we should do cap and trade, and the whole world should do cap and trade. So this is not a conversion that is new. It is a reality that there were many in the energy sector that were quite clear-minded that climate change was going to be a risk to business and should be addressed. And in fact, to be slightly provocative, I would say that it was really only in the United States where there's been much debate about that. If you go to most of the rest of the world, the Chinese, for example, I lived in China for 14 years. There was no doubt in their mind that climate change was going to be a problem. Now, I would point out that didn't stop them from investing in coal, and a lot of it, but they knew that. And they did also invest a lot of money in technology to address climate change. Sonja's graph, I think, was very revealing of the result of that. They're the largest manufacturer of solar panels in the world. They have major investments in wind and wind technology. They've recently announced their intention to build battery mega plants. And Volvo Autos has announced that they will only be producing hybrid vehicles, electric hybrids, and electric vehicles. Now you might ask, well, what does Volvo have to do with the Chinese? Volvo Auto was purchased recently by Geely, and it's a Chinese company. The reason I emphasize these things is because climate is going to be a big factor, and therefore Arizona needs to be thinking about the time probably towards the middle of this century, although sooner would be better, about when all of the fossil fuel comes out of our system and how that happens. I think it's a tremendous opportunity for Arizona. We have some of the very best sun on the planet. And when I say that, what I mean by that is both in the intensity and the number of clear sky days that we have. It's a tremendous resource. We can think in terms of producing electric power that is available to supply to the rest of the country and in the future into Mexico. But we can also be more ambitious than that. We can think about the ways in which sunlight can be turned into other materials, and we can think about the way in which entire industries get shifted away from dependence on fossil fuels and fossil carbon raw materials into renewable materials that are based on energy from the sun and carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. So the last thing I will say then is that this is an opportunity. It could make a great economic bump for the state. We could eliminate the roughly $12 billion of carbon that we invest in bringing energy, primary energy into the state. And it can also propel us to an environment where we don't worry so much about ozone and air quality, where streets are quiet, and it becomes just a little bit more pleasant than it already is as a place to live. Thank you, Senator.
Thank you very much, Dr. Dirks. Next, we'll be having Dr. Hallie Aiken. She is an associate professor of sustainability science with the School of Sustainability at Arizona State University. She acquired her doctoral degree from the University of Arizona in geography and her undergraduate in environmental studies from Brown University. She has done research with an international initiative exploring sustainability and resilient implications of social hydrological risk in Mexico City, and she's also has done some research in water policy and climate change, adaptation in one of Arizona's 5 Cs, the cotton sector. So welcome to the Senate, Dr. Aiken.
Thank you, Senator. It's a real pleasure to be here. Great. Thank you, Sonja. So I will be talking a little bit about the ag sector. As Senator said, this is one of our primary industries here in the state. As many of you probably will already know at the top of your head, this is almost a $4 billion a year industry in the state. It's covers a lot of land area, and almost all of it is irrigated. And that's really what makes this issue of environmental change pretty critical for the state, is this dependence on irrigation, which is kind of ironic in the sense that we often think of rain-fed agriculture as being the most sensitive. But here we have an industry that's very much dependent on a lot of infrastructure and a lot of resources that are being pumped up from our aquifers and piped in from other watersheds, or from the Colorado River specifically. So we have a diversity of products in the state, from the fruits and vegetables in Yuma. These are some of the primary suppliers for the country. So we have dairy here in Maricopa County with cotton and alfalfa. And Pinal. Those Yuma, Maricopa, and Pinal, of course, are our primary counties for production. When we think about the farmers in the state, we also have a fairly interesting profile that is a bit different from the national average. So we have a lot of farmers here that are Native American, and actually more female farmers than the national average as well. And one thing that is not much different from the rest of the country is the average age, 61 years. So this is something that's also significant as we think about what environmental change is going to bring in the future. We also have an aging farm population, and that has to be considered in the context of who are going to be the next generations of farmers and where are they coming from. So when we think about environmental change and what farmers are already experiencing here in the Southwest, there are three particular issues that come to mind immediately. Changes in precipitation. The Southwest has been the kind of the hot spot in the United States for increasing dry spells and declining annual average precipitation, which is what the figure on the top of this slide demonstrates. And then also in terms of rising temperatures. But most critically, for those growers who are dependent particularly on our surface water sources, is the change in snowpack. So as we have, and that's this graph on the right here, which you can see these kind of red dots. This is illustrates declining snowpack in Arizona, which has a and also up in the Colorado River Basin. And this has a very significant effect on stream flow and what comes down through the system and is made available in our irrigation districts. So when we think about the future, we can anticipate most of the science is suggesting, and this is actually a graph from the very recent report that just came out by the U.S. Global Change Research Program, that we can anticipate more of what we have been experiencing. So increasing aridity in the Southwest, declining winter and spring snowpack, and then the probability of multi-decadal drought, which has been illustrated to be a feature of this region for a long time, and this is something that we need to be considering, is that we're not just talking about gradual declines. We may be in periods of significant drought that last more than 1 decade. So continue. This is a graph that the Bureau of Reclamation produced that was just trying to look at the implications of changing environmental conditions for the Colorado River, which plays a really critical role for a lot of agriculture, particularly here in central Arizona. And what this figure illustrates is that when we consider projected demand with population growth in this region and in the Colorado River Basin, against looking at what the snowpack is going to be and what we can expect with increased evaporation,
we can see declining supply and not being able to meet the demand. Now, this is a particularly deep concern for Arizona agriculture, because unless you're getting your irrigation directly from the Colorado River, agriculture often is not on a priority in terms of access to that water. So if it becomes less available, particularly in central Arizona, farmers may have to cut back first. Next. So what can we expect? Well, what the evidence is accumulating, talking to farmers and looking at trends in the Arizona region, what most experts are anticipating is that there will be a shift that we've already seen of increased urbanization of agricultural land. We've seen that here in the valley, and we can see it along the kind of Sun Corridor. This will imply a loss in income employment in the sector for those who are moving out of the industry. But one of the more interesting, perhaps, and less considered effects is this idea that agriculture has kind of served for many decades as a kind of a reservoir of water for the region, in that farmers have moved off of groundwater in order to take advantage of the CAP with the Central Arizona Project water, while cities grew into that allotment. So much of that water has been stored in underground reservoirs and hasn't been drawn. And the idea was this would save and create a reservoir for future population growth in the state. As we urbanize that area, you do get a decline in the kind of per acre water consumption. But that water also becomes what they say hardened, in the sense that it's much less flexible in terms of what the annual demand is. People want their water, they want it constantly, and that demand is not likely to be something you can negotiate from a year to year. Where agriculture actually has a possibility of retiring land one year from production, putting back in production in another year. Farmers have experimented with some of these types of mechanisms as water scarcity has increased across the region, and particularly in California. Of course, there are challenges to these types of arrangements. What kinds of compensation? How are farmers going to be able to maintain a livelihood during years where they're not perhaps producing? What are the kinds of institutional and infrastructural arrangements? But there are possibilities. The other interesting feature about agriculture is that water is not always completely consumed by the crop. And so there is water that percolates back into the groundwater. So it is a use of water that actually can, and particularly if there's adjustments to production practices, provide other types of services in the region in terms of both letting water go into streams and providing other types of ecological resources, as well as effects for cities. And maybe my colleague will talk a little bit about that. So the next slide, please. So one of the things that we also need to always recognize is that the environmental change isn't the only thing that farmers and ranchers in the state are dealing with. And the experience of these environmental changes are going to be quite complicated depending on what your source of water is. Are you more groundwater dependent? Are you more surface water dependent? There are places like in Buckeye that have a surplus of water. So how you're getting your water, what the rights are to that water, and how secure those rights are. So if you're on the Colorado River, you may have preference, but if you're using CAP water here in the Central Valley, your rights are less priority in terms of those issues of increasing water scarcity. The other issue that was made very clear in our consultations with area growers here in Central Arizona was the energy intensity of water. So as oil prices increase or as energy costs increase, water prices also are affected. And so they may be even more sensitive to the energy coupling with water than they are from the climate directly. The other issue that farmers face here is, of course, the land values, and there's, maintaining production as there's increasing competition with water and land from urban interests. And many farmers, ranchers, and growers believe that, or feel that that's actually, that's their retirement. They're looking forward to being able to move out of the sector. Others want to stay in. So there's a lot of complexity in what the sector is going to look like in the future. Again, the other issue is demographic trends as farmers retire, as ranchers and growers move out of production, whether the younger generation is going to want to farm, where they're going to want to farm, what type of farming they're going to want to do. And a lot of that's going to have to do with what kind of incentives and rights they will be entitled to in terms of water, how secure their land tenure can be in an urbanizing context. And one of the final issues is Native American agriculture. So Native American populations in the state have often obtained water rights that will allow them to continue to produce if they choose to. Many modeling efforts that ASU has done demonstrate that one possible scenario would be kind of a retreat of agriculture into Native American lands if there's an option to lease land there because of the water availability. This is an opportunity. It's also, as we know, most of the, in terms of majority of farmers or growers in the state operators are Native American, over 50%. So thinking about the role of agriculture and its the sensitivity of production in Native American areas is something that is of a particular interest when we think about what the sector is going to do. So this graph that you see here on the right is just a result of some surveys we did with cotton growers and alfalfa growers in the central Arizona area, just to try and get a sense of the other types of stressors that they are facing and what they think is going to be affecting their viability. And as you can see, the most greatest concern there was surface water availability. They were seeing a lot more volatility in water prices than they had seen in the past, followed by commodity prices and this issue of urban development and demand for land, and whether they would be able to farm given the combination of these multiple stressors. Next. So what can be done about this? Well, there's a lot of discussion of, how can the sector adjust? And of course, there are a number of things that farmers and growers, ranchers are doing on their own, on their land as they face different types of constraints. Many are already adjusting by adopting drip irrigation and trying to increase their water efficiency. It's important to note that when growers do that, they are not necessarily making more water available for other sectors. It's increasing the efficiency with which their crops uptake water. So it's not necessarily a savings for urban sector or, for example, environmental uses of water. But it is an improvement in terms of what they're getting out of the water for their own production. We also see concentration of production where water rights are strong, so where they have confidence that they will have that water into the future. And many economists in the state believe that there will be, under increasing water stress, there'll be a shift to higher value crops. So these are the vegetables and fruits, which often will give you more revenue for the water and resources applied versus some of the more commodity crops. But perhaps one of the more interesting and important areas of adaptation is going to be in policy. And this is something I'd like to stress. I think Arizona has already, as you probably heard in previous discussions on this topic, has been a real innovator in water policy over a century and really set the game nationally. And so now, as we think about the role of agriculture in the future, how will water be priced, whether there'll be a development of water markets between urban areas and agricultural areas, what would that look like? How can we make these issues, water trading more effective and equitable? between Native American reservations, if there's opportunities for that. And then because of the functions that agriculture can potentially play, and this is also an area where I believe there's more research needed in terms of what kinds of agriculture can provide additional types of services, perhaps for urban areas and for ecological needs in the state. There's a potential for urban agriculture and environmental interactions and kind of innovations to see what sorts of new arrangements can be made so that both agriculture's needs and other sector needs can be met. So I'd just like to conclude with an emphasis that we often think about a sector as kind of in isolation and agriculture being out there affected directly by environmental change and what are farmers and growers and going to be able to do with it. But actually, when we speak with growers here in Central Arizona, it's clear to them, or at least what they express to us, that it's really a matter of choice. It's a matter of where we want to put our resources in this state. And that's going to be something that has to be explored in a kind of a more public debate. What is the role of agriculture? How important is it to maintain land in production? What sorts of incentives or resources are going to be allocated for that opportunity? What are the costs? And particularly as the state urbanizes, what is the relationship between urban interests and municipal water demands and municipal land interests and the relationship with agriculture? Is there a benefit? Is there of having open space around cities, near cities? What is the interest of the sector in playing different roles as the state evolves in terms of its landscapes and demographics? So that's just kind of an opening up for exploration, but I think there's real opportunities there as Arizona looks to see what directions they want to take in the future.
Thank you so much. Next, I'd like to introduce Dr. David Saylor. Dr. Saylor is a professor of the School of Geographical Sciences and Urban Planning and director of the Urban Climate Research Center. Prior to joining ASU, Dr. Saylor was on the faculties of both Tulane University and Portland State University. When he was at Tulane, he was the director of the South Central Regional Center for the National Institute of Global Environmental Change. Now that's a mouthful. And when he was at Portland State, he was the founding director of the Green Building Research Laboratory, both areas that interest me personally. And his scholarly agenda is based on the intersection of climate with the built environment. He's also interested in renewable energy, energy consumption, and his current research projects with National Science Foundation and the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency are exploring potential for mitigating indoor and outdoor thermal environment and air quality with the emphasis on vulnerable elderly populations, and that's my #1 constituency. Is I have a lot of children in my district, but the elderly population is the biggest. So with that, welcome to the Senate, Dr. Saylor.
Okay, well, thank you, Senator. It's really a pleasure to be here. And we've had a bit of a discussion already today on various solutions sort of targeting global climate change. And so I'm going to bring us a bit to a smaller scale. We're going to be talking about urban scales. And one of the key aspects of the urban scale is that the solutions at the global scale have very local, oftentimes significant co-benefits as well. So my presentation is focused around sort of 3 fundamental questions around the topic of managing urban climates. First question is what? What is it that we intend to manage? And then we'll follow that up with the why. And then we'll finish up once we understand the what and why, we'll go to the how, the implementation strategies. So on this slide, you see that in terms of the what, there are a number of different aspects of the urban climate system that concern us. Chief among these include air quality and extreme heat. And in particular, when we think about extreme heat in Arizona, the historical record shows that we are warming dramatically. Over the past 60 years, for example, the nighttime minimum temperature at Sky Harbor Airport has increased by more than 9 degrees Fahrenheit. The daytime maximum temperatures in summer have also increased, but nowhere near as much. However, that combined effect has very significant ramifications for the health and well-being of our populations. And of course, as global citizens, we're also interested in how our actions affect the global climate system and vice versa. So moving on to the why, again, I'm focused on urban climate and local climate in particular. And again, the implications that we're really concerned with largely focus on health and well-being of urban populations. And that translates into a number of different health outcomes ranging from heat-related morbidity and mortality. In fact, in Maricopa County alone, there were about 130 deaths associated with extreme heat in the year 2016. There's been an increasing trend with that. And so this and other sort of heat-related illnesses are chief among many of our concerns, but there are other endpoint implications of local climate for health and well-being, things that we may not often think about in terms of that connection, but things like valley fever, mental health, the role that reduced physical activity has in health outcomes, and the economic and equity issues that are associated with that. And so, of course, all of this factors into an economic vitality risk for the city and the state in terms of future population growth and in terms of tourism and how business expansion or lack thereof might be implicated in terms of both the reality and the perception of the local climate in the state from afar. And then, of course, all of that links into the interventions. What is it that we can do about local climate as it relates to the health and well-being of our societies and the economic vitality of the state? And those interventions fall in a range of categories, everything from planning to policies and of course, education as well. So now getting on to the how. So before we really talk about specific strategies, we need to understand, at least at some level, the science of what's affecting the local climate. What makes the city of Phoenix, for example, hotter than it needs to be? And so there are a number of factors illustrated on this chart. Everything from waste heat emissions and pollution from human activities. That's from the transportation sector, that's from the building sector, that's from industry, as well as the role that the choices of materials that we use in our buildings plays in the urban climate, and the morphology of our cities. How do we design the built environment? The spaces between buildings, for example, have a lot to do with trapping energy during the day and retaining it at night and keeping our cities hotter than they need to be. And then, of course, cities in general tend to have a relative lack of moisture that can be used for evaporative cooling of the city surface. And so let's move on to the next one. So getting into the question of how, there are a few illustrations I want to give in terms of some specific examples of strategies. So these two pictures are a visible image and then an infrared image of two buildings actually in Portland, Oregon. My office used to be in that building on the right with a white roof. The city building was the one next to us. And just the choice of materials makes a huge difference. You think about the rooftop surface temperatures of these two buildings, and you see on a hot summer day, even in Portland, 150 degrees Fahrenheit for the dark roof, whereas the cooler white roof, 110 degrees Fahrenheit. That has huge implications, not just for the surface temperatures, but for the air flowing over those surfaces as it convects heat into the urban environment, as well as the conduction of heat into the building and the resulting increases in air conditioning energy demand. The same kinds of principles can be applied at the street level. This actually is just an image of a typical street. But whether you're thinking about typical streets or highly reflective, or what we call high albedo streets, but you can also think about the role of shading in street canyons. Here you see the effects of shade trees and buildings dramatically cooling the sidewalks that pedestrians are walking on. Other strategies, it's not all just about the air temperature that we're exposed to in terms of thermal comfort. This is an image from the student union out front in front of Arizona State University here in Tempe. And the thermal experience of the pedestrians walking under there is dictated by a combination of the air temperature and the surface temperatures surrounding them, and the wind speed, and also, of course, the direct incident radiation, both from the sun and from the surfaces around them. So here's an example where you can think of a hybrid application of a technology. Those photovoltaic panels above them are generating quite a bit of energy on a hot summer day, and at the same time providing a cool, comfortable environment for the people underneath. You don't necessarily need to go to high technology to provide cooling. We have lots of parks in our cities, but oftentimes these parks are not very useful because they're frankly just too hot in the summer. There are lots of instances of children burning themselves going down slides that are unshaded on hot summer days. And so the extent to which we can make our public spaces more people-friendly in terms of accessible during the hotter conditions in our summers, again, that has that indirect health benefit in terms of making the population more active and happier. And then, of course, technologies related to energy efficiency in general, whether it's energy efficiency in buildings or in our vehicle sector, have huge implications for urban climate. That we often think about these strategies in terms of carbon reductions, and global climate. But within the city, 1/3 of the total energy released into the city in terms of waste heat is typically from vehicles. And so the more you can go to high mileage vehicles or electric vehicles, the more you can reduce waste heat emission into the cities. Likewise with buildings, the more energy efficient our buildings, the less waste heat they dump into the environment, and the better thermal environments we can have. So next I want to talk about implementation mechanisms for specific solutions. The text on this slide is rather small, but the basic concept is this. We have a number of different ideas about how we can cool and make urban environments more comfortable. Many of them connect with other aspects of sustainability solutions, but how do we implement these? And so there are a range of actors that can actually play a role in implementing solutions, everything from individuals to city governments. You might have to tap 3 or 4 or 5 times here to get through these. Just keep going until you're on the other side. All the way to state level, whether it's building codes or emission standards, all these types of activities have a role to play in terms of implementing solution strategies that can improve our thermal environments. And if we go to this next slide, this is really sort of the summary of what I want to get across is the notion that these strategies don't act independently and in isolation. And so oftentimes, whether it's in city or state government or in academia, we're very compartmentalized in our focus on certain topics. And urban climate challenges and the solutions don't respect boundaries. And so you take a strategy like high albedo surfaces. It tends to reduce surface temperatures. That ends up affecting air temperatures because air flows over the surfaces, so that can cool the air. That, in turn, combines to provide better thermal environments, which also reduces air conditioning energy use. That effect then reduces waste heat emissions into the environment, and so we start to see these feedback loops. Well, that will further reduce air temperatures, and it'll also affect the emission of pollutants. And so all the different strategies that you can think about will enter into this nested feedback loops at some different points, but they're all intertwined. And so we need to be thinking about that as we think about the solution strategies that we are intending to put forth moving forward, is how do we design them to best take advantage of these feedbacks and these interactions and really take full advantage of the co-benefits, while recognizing that there will, of course, be adverse consequences that are unintended, and we have to look at the entirety of the outcomes. And that's the extent of my comments. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much. I have lots of questions. And if anyone in the audience has a question, please come up to the podium. But I'm going to start with one for you first, Dr. Saylor. I know you haven't been in Arizona that long, but have you had any opportunity for cooperation with architects, designers, and the home building industry? I live in U of A territory, but I also, if there are environmental events at ASU, I often travel up. And last spring, I did go to a solar energy event at ASU, and I learned that, I heard from one city manager that they're requiring and I forget what town it's in, but they're requiring new homes to have at least some rooftop availability for solar panels. I think it was maybe at least 6, solar panels. I was very lucky when I built my house without thinking about it. I'm almost 100%, I'm 180 going south within a very, very small margin. But have you seen cooperation with the building industry in Arizona at all?
So as you mentioned in my bio, I am relatively new here to the Phoenix metro area. That said, part of what attracted me to ASU was that at least within the university, there's a tremendous amount of collaboration across disciplines. Mm-hmm. In fact, disciplinary boundaries are really quite blurred. Mm-hmm. And so we have been interacting quite a bit across from engineering to geography to urban planning to design, working with different faculty and different teams. And through those collaborations, we've been working with different entities within city governments, within the county health department, but also we've got some partnerships now where we're actually exploring collaborations with APS on some research related to photovoltaics and their connection to the urban climate system, as well as we've got some private connections where we're looking at performance of buildings for a local health club, and so we're dealing with a variety of local actors, and increasingly you see much better integration in the building sector in general, in the, say, green building industry, a lot more collaboration than you ever had before in terms of the designers, the architects, the engineers, working in a team environment to design buildings that are more efficient to start with.
Great. And I'm sorry if I'm going to skip around my questions, and other members of the panel, if you wish to answer a question, some of them are, but yours was kind of specific, but some of my others, I often testify at the Arizona Corporation Commission. I just would like to know your feeling, if you think that there's room for rooftop solar and utility solar in the mix in Arizona at the present time. Shall I start with that? Yeah, sure.
Yeah, absolutely, yes. I mean, and it's already happening. We have rooftop solar doing well and could do better. There's much more opportunity, but at the same time, utility scale and community scale are coming in. So again, going back to my opening remarks about it not being entirely clear what the system is going to look like 20, 30 years from now, I think it's very fair to say it's going to be a mixed energy system, and there's going to be solar systems of all different scales. And they will all play a slightly different role in the performance of that system, but an important role.
Okay. Well, I represent Legislative District 2, and I'm very lucky to have a lot of the taste of the West in my suburban community. Sometimes I get to see young horses running around. Sometimes I have loose cattle, but I'm also privileged to live next to pecan groves. And I'm glad you mentioned, Dr. Aiken, that you mentioned drip irrigation, because I know that they wish they had started that much sooner. And I also represent Santa Cruz County, and in Pima also I have vineyards. How do you see the current challenges for pecans and for wine? I mean, and north of me in Pima, we do have some cotton and some other things. How do you see the future for those two crops specifically?
Well, I've actually not directly studied viniculture in Arizona. I think there are new opportunities that particular water constraints and the climate, which is actually quite apt for some crops, can provide. And so in some regions, there may be an opportunity for the expansion of new crops. There's also, one of the trends nationally is while we see this aging population in many of the commodity crops, we're seeing rapid growth in some niche markets, and particularly in organics, but also in urban gardening, and then viniculture, I think, has also, I don't have the stats on this, but has been surging in new and novel places across the United States as different conditions, both market as well as, and probably primarily market, but also taking advantage of adequate environmental conditions. So I think there are, depending on the commodity, there's going to be very different opportunities. Pecans have had in California in the recent drought a particularly hard time, and some of these tree crops, when you require a constant supply of water, so if there is a lot of variability, and tree crops are an investment, it takes a while for them to become productive, and so once you've got them in the ground, your flexibility in terms of adapting to we call interannual variability in environmental conditions, can be constrained. And I think that is something that farmers in California were dealing with because the pecan market had expanded. So these are, the constraints are going to be different. The other issue that I think is really important in Arizona is that we do have a certain kind of geographic concentration of particular commodities. And there's a lot of infrastructure that's been built up around that. And so, for example, you often hear, maybe some urban residents say, well, why aren't the cotton growers in the valley, supplying the city with tomatoes and watermelon? And the growers will say, well, our soils aren't really adequate. They're very salinated. We need to use flood irrigation. We can't do drip because we need to flush the soils. And then they also, a lot of the cold storage, the transportation, a lot of the market infrastructure is in the southern part of the state in Yuma. So they, going out it alone and doing some shifting, even if you think that it might be what the direction of the future, you've kind of got to do it where there's also some support structures. So that it's a very complicated situation in terms of vulnerability of different types of producers.
In August, former Secretary of State in Arizona has a new business venture, and he's doing some hydroponic. It's a startup, but it has I think possibly a lot of positive implications, not only for Arizona, but for places where there might be food deserts. Because if you have an empty warehouse, you can set it up, and I was very impressed with this. So keep an eye out for it. It's in Congress, Arizona, which you probably haven't been to yet. It's not too far from Wickenburg. One of the challenges we have is, well, first of all, climate change has been kind of become toxic, and we have a lot of things in Arizona that become toxic. But I would like a simple way, Dr. Klinsky, to explain carbon pricing, if you could give me some really, really simple examples that I can talk to my constituents about, because I think that's all, I think it could be very complicated, but if you could just give me a couple of simple examples, I would really appreciate that.
Yeah, I mean, it's a shame that climate change has become a partisan issue in the United States. It was not always a partisan issue, and it does not need to be a partisan issue. So just to remind people that the United States signed on to the Global Climate Agreement under the first Bush era. This goes back a long time. So it doesn't need to be partisan. In fact, one of the most recent carbon pricing proposals comes from a group of very senior Republicans who were both advisors to the Bush and Reagan era. Now, the idea of a carbon price is quite simple. It's that if you make something free, people don't value it very much. So if you had free anything, you're giving away free ice cream on the street, people might eat it, they might not eat it, they might throw it in the ground. It's not worth anything to them. It's the same idea with a carbon price. It's saying, actually, when we have too much emissions in the atmosphere, it has a negative implication for everybody. So to encourage people not to just sort of throw it around and waste it, we can put a price on it. And by putting a price on it, we don't have to regulate every single person who produces carbon dioxide. So it would be like, instead of us going up to every single person who has free ice cream and saying, you're not allowed to throw that out, you're not allowed to dump that in the ground, don't make sure you clean that up, that would really be a pain, right? It would take a lot of resources to have to tell every single person what they can and cannot do with their ice cream. Instead, we might say, you have to buy this ice cream, which means that people would only buy it if they were going to use it productively. They would value it. It's the same idea with a carbon price. You simply are saying, this is worth something. You need to pay for it in some capacity as a way of sending a signal to everybody without having a lot of very complicated regulation that this is how you have to do it. So that's the basics of a carbon price. All you're trying to do is send a signal to every person who uses emissions, which is actually all of us, that this is worth something, so that they value it and think differently about their decisions. There's different ways you can do it, and that's where it can get a little bit complicated. You can put a flat fee on it of some sort. So for instance, the Republicans have been talking about a cap and dividend, where you have a fee for anyone who uses carbon, and then that goes into a pot of money, which then goes back to everyday people, so that people in the end aren't worse off. You can do what a number of jurisdictions have done, like British Columbia, where they have a flat carbon tax. Again, what that allows them to do is cut other kinds of taxes, which may be detrimental to business. So in British Columbia, that carbon tax ended up with huge cuts to corporate tax and higher payroll taxes. You can also do a cap and trade system where every different entity is given a cap and then they trade them depending on the market, and that can both produce a cost to carbon, but it also can generate a lot of investment in things like renewable energy. There's lots of ways of doing it, but the important thing that runs through all of it is simply sending a message to every single person, company, etc., that there is a value to carbon.
Thank you very much. I just want to preface some of my comments that I'm a Tucson Electric Power company solar customer, so I don't get very big bills. And someone mentioned about cutting down on particulates. In the Tucson operation of TEP, they've stopped using coal, and they do use natural gas. And Dr. Dirks, I liked your comment that be away from all fossil fuel eventually, because I don't think natural gas is a long-term solution. And they do have solar, so I'm very pleased with that. And you mentioned, Dr. Aiken, you mentioned about the female farmers, and I'm sorry that Senator Jamesita Peshlikai, who is a Navajo, is not here today. She's also on the Natural Resources, Energy, and Water Committee, as is Lisa Atondo, who's from Yuma. So we just have a lot of conflicting events here. today, but the Arizona legislature is #1 for women in the country at the present time. We're at 40%. I guess maybe my last question deals with Navajo Generating Station, though. You know, I often, when I was in the House, I was elected in 12, sworn in 13, and I served for 13 months in the House, and I know when a Native American bill came up on in a committee meeting, I'd often say to people, I don't think you should vote unless you've been to the reservations and see the challenges that the people face here. I'm just wondering if any of you have any insight whether Navajo Generating Plant is there an energy solution to it with coal going away? Because I'm concerned. I'm concerned about jobs and the economic, and I think any solution we have, I'm glad that several of you mentioned tribal concerns, and I'm just wondering if there could be any kind of energy. And I have toured it. They only let us tour it in good, good days that the air is really clean. And I know this was going to go to Dr. Dirks.
Well, I'll at least start there.
Yeah.
It depends a little bit on what exactly you mean when you say, is there an energy solution? And I put it that way because it is an interesting place to put solar or renewable energy assets because there's a fairly substantial transmission hub there. Mm-hmm. And that means the electricity that would be generated there could go to a number of different parts of the Southwest. And so I think it's fair to say that members of the tribe and the Navajo Utility Company and others are looking at options to go there. But we should be quite clear-minded that it's not really going to solve the economic problem. And the reason that I say that bluntly is because one of the ways in which solar energy or wind energy achieve the low costs that they do is that you don't need people to operate them. And so even large solar arrays won't generate many jobs. They will generate some income depending on leasing of the land and whether the tribe chooses to invest in the facilities themselves, but not so many jobs. And as it happens, as we speak, a team from Arizona State University and Northern Arizona University are gathering in Flagstaff with the Navajo and other interested parties to kick off a program to investigate options for how they might deal with the economic consequences. And I think the Navajo Generating Station is an example of the challenges that we have to be willing to face as the energy system transitions. Certainly when I look at that plant through the eyes of the future of the energy system, you can't help but say, well, that plant has to come out of the system. Its costs are too high, and coal is not the right primary energy source. But when we make these choices, we have to be conscious of the fact that we are leaving people behind when we do that. And I think some of the issues that we are facing here in the United States, and the United States isn't alone in this, actually arise because change that you can justify from a raw economic standpoint or from raw considerations of what a sustainable future needs to look like leaves people behind. And aside from the moral and ethical dilemmas that creates, It also creates instabilities, social instabilities that undermine the integrity of those communities and sometimes undermine the integrity of social systems that go well beyond those communities. So I think there is some important things that we have to be reflecting deeply on as we think about the ever accelerating pace of change that's coming not just to the United States but to the whole world.
Well, thank you all very much, and I especially want to thank Dr. Sonja Klinsky because you brought to us a very, very rich smorgasbord of intelligence, of commitment, and information, and I'm just very, very grateful to you and to each of the panelists and to ASU for letting you attend here today, and thank you all very much.